The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, piercing the pre-dawn darkness over the Hindu Kush Mountains. Raptor flight, this is Overlord. RTB immediately. Mission abort. The transmission sent shockwaves through the Tactical Operations Center at Bagram Air Base. Four F-22 Raptors, America's most advanced stealth fighters, were being ordered to return to base just minutes before inserting a Navy SEAL team into the most dangerous valley in Afghanistan. Major Kestrel Viper, Thorne sat in the cockpit of her A-10 Thunderbolt II, watching the sleek Raptors bank eastward toward safety. Her aircraft, nicknamed Hog by those who flew her, was everything the F-22s were not: ugly, slow, and built for punishment rather than glory. The twin engines mounted high on her fuselage hummed their familiar drone, a sound that had become Viper's lullaby over 3 combat deployments. Ghost Rider 2-1, maintain holding pattern, came the voice of Colonel Marcus Webb from the TOC. Even through the encrypted comms, Viper could hear the tension. Something had gone catastrophically wrong with Operation Steel Rain, the classified mission to extract a high-value target from a Taliban stronghold in the Pech Valley. The intelligence package had been solid, until 30 minutes ago, when everything changed. Viper adjusted her night vision goggles and scanned the darkness below. Somewhere in those jagged peaks, 16 Navy SEALs were waiting for air support that had just vanished into the night. The F-22s carried precision munitions that could thread a needle from 20,000 feet, but they also carried pilots who followed orders without question. Viper understood why command had pulled them back. The political ramifications of losing a Raptor to enemy fire would be devastating. But understanding didn't make it right. Overlord Ghost Rider 2-1, she transmitted, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. What's the status on ground assets? Static filled her headset for long seconds before Webb's voice returned, tight with barely controlled frustration. Stand by, Ghost Rider. That phrase, stand by, was military speak for everything is going to hell, but we can't tell you why. Viper had heard it before in other valleys, on other nights when good men died waiting for answers that never came. She banked her Hog in a lazy circle, maintaining altitude while her mind raced through possibilities. The mission brief had been straightforward. Provide close air support for SEAL Team 6's extraction of a Taliban commander who allegedly possessed intelligence about an imminent attack on American soil. The target was holed up in a compound built into the mountainside, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through a canyon the locals called the Throat of Shaitan, the Devil's Throat. Now, with the Raptors gone and radio silence from the ground team, Viper found herself alone in a sky that suddenly felt much larger and infinitely more dangerous. The first hint that everything had changed came not through official channels, but through a frequency she wasn't supposed to monitor, the emergency band used by Special Operations Forces when standard comms failed. The voice was barely above a whisper, distorted by distance and interference, but unmistakably American. Any station, this is Neptune 6. We have wounded and need immediate extract. Grid follows. The transmission dissolved into static, but Viper had caught enough. Neptune 6 was the call sign for Lieutenant Commander Jake Poseidon Morrison, the SEAL team leader she'd worked with on 2 previous operations. Viper's jaw tightened as she switched to the TOC frequency. Overlord Ghost Rider 2-1, I'm picking up emergency traffic on guard. Recommend we. Negative, Ghost Rider. Maintain holding pattern and await instructions. Webb's voice cut through her transmission like a blade. That's a direct order. Through her cockpit canopy, Viper could see the first pale glow of dawn beginning to touch the eastern peaks. Time was running out. The Taliban were most active during daylight hours, and the longer Neptune team remained on the ground, the higher the chance they'd be discovered. She'd seen what happened to special operations teams caught in the open by superior numbers. The images were burned into her memory from previous tour. Her fingers drummed against the throttle as she weighed her options. 32 years old with over 2,000 combat hours in the hog, Major Kestrel Thorne had never disobeyed a direct order. Her record was spotless, her efficiency reports exemplary, and her dedication to the mission absolute. She was, by every metric that mattered to the Air Force, the perfect pilot. But perfection, she was beginning to understand, sometimes meant being perfectly willing to let good people die for the sake of protocol. The radio crackled again, this time on a frequency reserved for aircraft-to-aircraft communication. "Ghost Rider, this is Raptor Lead." The voice belonged to Lieutenant Colonel David Stryker Kane, the F-22 flight commander she'd worked with on joint operations. "We're clear of the area. Fuel state allows for 30 minutes on station if you need backup." It was a subtle offer, carefully worded to avoid any appearance of insubordination. The Raptors were following orders by withdrawing, but they weren't abandoning the mission entirely. They were giving Viper options and moral cover if she chose to act. "Copy Raptor Lead," she replied, her decision crystallizing like ice in winter air. "Ghost Rider is Winchester on patience." Military slang for out of ammunition, but Kane would understand the real meaning. Viper was out of patience with orders that prioritized politics over lives. She banked her A-10 toward the coordinates she'd memorized from the SEAL team's emergency transmission, knowing that once she crossed into hostile airspace without authorization, there would be no going back. Her career, built over 15 years of exemplary service, would likely end with a court-martial. But careers could be rebuilt. The men trapped in the devil's throat couldn't be. The Hindu Kush mountains rose before her like the backbone of some primordial beast, their snow-capped peaks gleaming in the growing light. Somewhere among those rocky spines, Neptune team was fighting for their lives, and the only thing standing between them and annihilation was an outdated attack aircraft that most modern pilots considered a relic. But Viper knew something those sleek fighter jocks didn't. Sometimes the old ways were the best ways, and sometimes the most beautiful thing in the sky was the ugliest bird in the Air Force inventory. As she descended into the valleys where angels feared to tread, Major Kestrel Viper Thorne smiled grimly behind her oxygen mask. It was time to show them what a hog could do. Her approach to the target area was textbook, low and fast, using the terrain to mask her heat signature from shoulder-fired missiles. The A-10's titanium bathtub surrounding the cockpit was designed to withstand direct hits from anti-aircraft artillery, but Viper preferred not to test those specifications if she could avoid it. Better to be invisible than invincible. The valley floor rushed beneath her wings as she followed a dry riverbed deeper into Taliban territory. Her heads-up display painted a digital landscape over the physical world, marking known enemy positions with red triangles and friendly forces with blue diamonds. The problem was, most of the intelligence was 12 hours old, ancient history in a fluid combat environment. "Ghost Rider 2-1 Overlord." Webb's voice filled her headset, tight with barely controlled anger. "You are ordered to return to base immediately. Acknowledge." Viper reached over and switched off her primary radio, leaving only the emergency frequencies active. In the sudden quiet, she could hear her own breathing through the oxygen mask, steady and controlled despite the gravity of what she was doing. This was career suicide, but it was also the right thing to do, and sometimes those were the same thing. The first enemy contact came not as a radio transmission or a radar warning, but as a glint of sunlight off metal in the rocks below. Years of combat experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now they were screaming danger. She banked hard left just as tracers began reaching up toward her aircraft, green streaks of death that passed close enough to her canopy to make her flinch. "Well, hello to you too," she muttered, rolling inverted to get a better look at the enemy positions. What she saw made her blood run cold. The intelligence briefing had mentioned scattered Taliban fighters, maybe a dozen insurgents with small arms and RPGs. What she was looking at was a full-scale ambush, At least 50 fighters dug into positions along both sides of the canyon, with heavy machine guns and what appeared to be a Soviet-era Zu-23 anti-aircraft gun. The Navy SEALs had walked into a meat grinder. She activated her emergency radio and transmitted on the frequency Neptune team would be monitoring. Neptune 6, Ghost Rider 2-1. I have eyes on multiple enemy positions in your vicinity. What's your situation? The response came immediately, Morrison's voice tight with pain and exhaustion. Ghost Rider, we're pinned down in a cave complex approximately 1 click north of primary target. 4 wounded, running low on ammo. We need close air support now. Viper's tactical display showed the SEAL team's position, a narrow ledge halfway up the canyon wall, with no cover except for the cave entrance behind them. The Taliban had them trapped like fish in a barrel, and it was only a matter of time before the insurgents worked up the courage to assault the position directly. Copy Neptune. Be advised, I'm Winchester on authorization but fully loaded otherwise. She was telling Morrison that she was acting without orders, but her weapon systems were hot and ready. Can you mark enemy positions? Negative on laser designation. Equipment damaged in initial contact, but I can talk you onto target. This was going to be old-school close air support, the kind that relied on pilot skill and forward observer expertise rather than precision-guided munitions and satellite imagery. It was also the kind that got people killed when things went wrong. Viper armed her 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon, the 7-barrel Gatling gun that was the A-10's primary weapon. Built around this massive cannon, the Hog could deliver 3,900 rounds per minute of depleted uranium death, each round capable of penetrating armored vehicles. Against infantry in the open, it was devastatingly effective, but only if she could get close enough without being shot down first. Neptune 6, I'm making my attack run from the south. Keep your heads down. She rolled her aircraft inverted and pulled the nose toward the canyon floor, building speed for what pilots called a low and slow. The A-10's signature attack profile that brought the aircraft within spitting distance of enemy forces. At this altitude, she was vulnerable to everything from rifle fire to RPGs, but she was also accurate enough to place rounds within meters of friendly forces. The rocky walls of the canyon flashed past her wingtips as she lined up on the first cluster of enemy positions. Her finger found the trigger for the GAU-8, and the world erupted in thunder. The sound of the Avenger cannon was unlike anything else in military aviation, a deep, bass-heavy roar that seemed to shake the very mountains. 30mm rounds walked across the enemy positions like the footsteps of an angry god, shattering rocks and silencing machine gun nests in explosions of dust and debris. Viper pulled up hard as she reached the far end of the canyon, G-forces pressing her deep into her ejection seat. Behind her, secondary explosions bloomed among the rocks as her rounds found ammunition stores and fuel caches. The Taliban fighters who had been so confident in their ambush positions suddenly found themselves on the receiving end of American firepower. Good hits, Ghost Rider. Morrison's voice carried a note of desperate hope. Enemy fire has decreased significantly, but we've got movement on the east wall. Looks like they're trying to flank us. Viper was already turning for her second pass, but this time she faced a new problem. The element of surprise was gone, and every Taliban fighter in the valley now knew exactly where she was. As she lined up for her attack run, the sky around her aircraft began to fill with tracers and rocket-propelled grenades. An RPG flashed past her port wing, close enough that she could see the fins stabilizing the warhead. Another impacted against the canyon wall, showering her aircraft with rock fragments that peppered her canopy like hail. The A-10 was tough, but it wasn't invincible, and she was flying straight into the teeth of concentrated enemy fire. But that was what Hog pilots did. They flew into hell and came back with their landing gear shot full of holes, and their fuselage decorated with bullet strikes, grinning like maniacs and asking when they could do it again. It was what separated them from the fighter jocks in their pristine air superiority birds. The second gun run was even more devastating than the first. Viper walked her cannon fire along the eastern canyon wall, systematically destroying each enemy position with surgical precision. Her heads-up display showed target after target disappearing from the battlefield as the 30 rounds found their mark. But the Taliban weren't giving up. As she climbed away from her second pass, her radar warning receiver began screaming. Someone had locked onto her aircraft with a surface-to-air missile system. "Ghost Rider, you've got a SAM launch." Morrison's voice was urgent. "Break right." Viper didn't need to be told twice. She threw the A-10 into a violent evasive maneuver, dropping chaff and flares while pulling GS that would have rendered most pilots unconscious. The missile streaked past her aircraft, its proximity fuse detonating close enough to rattle her teeth but not close enough to bring her down. As she leveled out, her damage assessment showed multiple minor hits but nothing critical. The Hawk was living up to its reputation as the most survivable aircraft in the Air Force inventory. Now, she just had to make sure the men on the ground lived up to theirs as the most elite warriors in the American military. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since the mission began, the odds were starting to shift in favor of the good guys. Morrison's voice crackled through the static. "Ghost Rider, we've got wounded who need immediate casevac. Can you establish a secure LZ?" The request sent a chill through Viper's spine. Creating a landing zone in hostile territory was complex enough with proper support, engineers, security teams, and medical personnel. Doing it alone, in a canyon crawling with Taliban fighters, bordered on impossible. But impossible was what they paid her for. "Neptune 6, what's the nature of casualties?" she asked, already scanning the terrain for potential helicopter landing sites. "2 urgent surgical, 1 priority. We need dust-off within 30 minutes or we're going to lose them." Viper's jaw tightened. Dust-off was military slang for medical evacuation, and the urgency in Morrison's voice told her everything she needed to know. Without immediate medical attention, 3 of America's finest warriors would die in this godforsaken valley. She keyed her radio to the frequency used by the medical evacuation helicopters. "Lifeline 7-1, Ghost Rider 2-1. I need immediate dust-off at grid." She rattled off the coordinates, knowing she was asking the helicopter crews to fly into the same killing zone that had nearly claimed her own aircraft. The response was immediate. "Ghost Rider, Lifeline 7-1. Unable to comply. Area remains hostile. Request you sanitize LZ prior to approach." Sanitize. Military euphemism for killing every enemy fighter in the area. Under normal circumstances, that would require hours of preparatory bombardment and coordinated ground assault. Viper had maybe 20 minutes before Morrison's wounded SEALs bled out. She banked her A-10 toward the widest section of the canyon, where a dry riverbed provided the only flat ground suitable for helicopter operations. The LZ was currently occupied by at least 24 Taliban fighters who had taken cover among the scattered boulders. They would have to be eliminated before any medical evacuation could proceed. This was going to require precision that went beyond normal close air support. She would need to clear every fighting position without damaging the landing area itself, a nearly impossible task under the best of circumstances. Viper selected her remaining Maverick missiles, precision-guided munitions designed to destroy tanks and harden targets. Against infantry in the open, they would be devastating, but she only had 4 left, and there were more than 4 enemy positions. "Neptune 6, I'm going to clear the LZ with precision strikes. Keep your wounded ready for immediate extraction." She rolled into her attack run, the familiar weight of combat decision-making settling onto her shoulders like an old, comfortable coat. Each Maverick would need to count, and each shot would bring her closer to the moment when she'd be flying an empty aircraft against overwhelming odds. The first missile found its target in a spectacular explosion that silenced a heavy machine gun position. The second and third eliminated the Zu-23 anti-aircraft gun and its crew. The fourth turned a cluster of fighters into vapor and scattered rocks. But there were still enemy positions active, still muzzle flashes winking from the shadows between boulders. Viper was down to her cannon, and whatever courage she could summon from the depths of her training and experience. That's when she remembered something her first squadron commander had told her during training. The A-10 isn't just a weapons platform. It's a flying statement that America doesn't abandon its people. Time to make that statement loud and clear. The remaining Taliban fighters had learned to fear the sound of her approach, but they were still disciplined enough to maintain their positions. As Viper began her final gun run, tracers reached up toward her aircraft like deadly fireworks. The volume of fire was lighter than before. She'd thinned their ranks considerably, but it only took one lucky shot to bring down even the toughest aircraft. Her cannon thundered again, walking 30 death across the remaining enemy positions. Dust and debris filled the air as rocks exploded and metal twisted under the impact of depleted uranium rounds. When she pulled up from her pass, the canyon floor was silent except for the settling dust and the distant echo of her engines. Neptune 6 LZ appears clear. Lifeline 7-1, you are cleared hot for immediate dust-off. The medical evacuation helicopter appeared on the horizon like salvation itself, its rotor blades beating the air as it descended into the canyon. Viper maintained overwatch, her remaining ammunition ready for any Taliban fighters who might emerge from concealment. But the canyon remained quiet. The enemy had either been eliminated or driven off for now. As the helicopter touched down and the SEALs loaded their wounded, Viper allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She'd saved lives today, even if it had cost her everything else. Her radio crackled with incoming traffic from Bagram, undoubtedly ordering her immediate return for disciplinary action. She ignored it. There was still work to do. Morrison's voice filled her headset one final time. Ghost Rider 2-1, Neptune 6. Mission complete. Thanks for the save. Anytime, Neptune. That's what we're here for. But as she turned her battle-damaged A-10 toward home, Viper knew that her fighting days were numbered. She'd crossed a line that the Air Force wouldn't forgive, even if history proved her right. The court-martial proceedings began exactly 1 week after Operation Steel Rain officially never happened. Major Kestrel Viper Thorne sat at the defendant's table in dress blue uniform, her ribbons and decorations a colorful testament to 15 years of exemplary service that was about to come to an ignominious end. The charges were serious: willful disobedience of a direct order, unauthorized engagement with enemy forces, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Each carried potential penalties ranging from reduction in rank to dismissal from service. Together, they spelled the end of everything she'd worked for since graduating from the Air Force Academy. Colonel Marcus Webb took the witness stand first, his testimony a carefully worded condemnation of Viper's actions that night in Afghanistan. He spoke of military discipline, the importance of following orders, and the dangerous precedent set by officers who decided for themselves when regulations could be ignored. Major Thorne's actions, while well-intentioned, represent a fundamental breakdown in military order, Webb testified. If every pilot decided which orders to follow based on personal judgment, we would have chaos instead of cohesion. The prosecution painted her as a rogue officer whose emotional decision-making had endangered not only herself but the broader mission. They presented evidence of her radio communications, her unauthorized entry into hostile airspace, and her engagement of enemy forces without proper authorization. But they couldn't present evidence of the lives she'd saved, because officially, those lives had never been in danger. Operation Steel Rain remained classified at levels that prevented most of the court-martial panel from knowing the full scope of what had happened that night. When Viper's defense attorney called Lieutenant Commander Jake Poseidon Morrison to testify, the courtroom atmosphere shifted subtly. Morrison walked with a slight limp, a souvenir from the ambush in the Devil's Throat, but his bearing was that of a warrior who had looked death in the eye and lived to tell about it. "Commander Morrison," the defense attorney began, "can you describe the tactical situation your team faced on the night in question?" Morrison's testimony was delivered in the flat, professional tone of a special operations veteran, but the words themselves painted a picture of desperate men facing overwhelming odds. He spoke of watching his teammates bleed while enemy fire kept them pinned down, of counting ammunition and knowing they didn't have enough, of preparing for a final stand against superior numbers. "At what point did Major Thorne's aircraft appear on station?" the attorney asked. "At the point when we had given up hope of surviving," Morrison replied without hesitation. "Her actions directly resulted in the survival of my entire team and the successful medical evacuation of 3 critically wounded personnel." The prosecution objected, arguing that Morrison's testimony was irrelevant to the question of whether Viper had disobeyed lawful orders. The judge sustained the objection, but the damage was done. The panel had heard what they needed to hear. When Viper took the stand in her own defense, she didn't try to justify her actions in terms of regulations or legal precedent. Instead, she spoke simply about the oath she'd taken as an Air Force officer, to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. "I swore to defend American lives," she testified. "When I heard those men calling for help, when I knew they were dying while we debated authorization procedures, I had a choice to make. I could follow orders and let them die, or I could act and save them. I chose to save them." The prosecutor pressed her on cross-examination. "Major Thorne, are you saying that military discipline should be abandoned whenever individual officers disagree with their orders?" Viper met his gaze steadily. "No, sir. I'm saying that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do, and sometimes doing the right thing costs everything you have." The deliberation lasted 3 hours. When the panel returned, their faces were grim with the weight of military justice. The verdict was guilty on all charges. There was no disputing the facts of what she'd done, but the sentence reflected something else entirely. Instead of dismissal from service, Viper received a letter of reprimand and reduction to the rank of captain. She would be transferred from combat operations to training duties. Her flying career effectively over, but her service record intact enough to allow for an honorable retirement. It was, everyone understood, the lightest possible sentence for such serious charges. The panel had found a way to maintain military discipline while acknowledging that sometimes courage and compassion required breaking the rules. As Viper left the courtroom, she was approached by a young airman she didn't recognize. "Ma'am," the airman said quietly, "I just wanted to say thank you. My brother was one of the SEALs you saved." That night, alone in her quarters, Captain Kestrel Thorne packed her belongings and prepared for transfer to a training base in Texas. Her combat flying days were over, but her influence on the next generation of pilots was just beginning. In the file cabinet beside her desk, she kept a letter from the families of the 3 SEALs whose lives she'd saved. It was worth more than all the medals and commendations she'd ever received. The Randolph Air Force Base flight line shimmered in the Texas heat as Captain Kestrel Thorne watched her new students prepare for their first close air support training mission. 2 years had passed since her court-martial, and she'd settled into her role as an instructor with the same dedication she'd once brought to combat operations. Her students were young, eager, and convinced they knew everything about flying and fighting. Most had never heard a shot fired in anger, never felt the weight of life-and-death decisions, never experienced the particular hell of knowing that good people were dying while bureaucracy debated authorization. Today's lesson was different from the standard curriculum. Instead of textbook scenarios with clearly defined enemy positions and unlimited ammunition, Viper had crafted something more realistic, a simulation based on her own experiences in Afghanistan, though she never told the students that. "Today we're going to discuss decision-making under pressure," she announced to the assembled pilots. "You'll be facing a scenario where the standard rules of engagement don't provide clear guidance, where following orders might mean abandoning people who are depending on you." Lieutenant Sarah Chen, one of her most promising students, raised her hand. "Ma'am, what if the orders are legitimate but the situation on the ground has changed?" It was a perceptive question, and one that cut to the heart of military ethics. Viper had wrestled with it for 2 years, in the quiet hours when sleep wouldn't come, and the ghosts of decisions past demanded accounting. "That's exactly what we're here to figure out," she replied. "Sometimes the right answer isn't in the manual. Sometimes you have to look deeper, to the oath you took, to the people you're sworn to protect, to the values that define what it means to be an American warrior." The simulation began with the students confident in their abilities and their understanding of proper procedures. But as the scenario unfolded, friendly forces pinned down, enemy positions multiplying, authorization delayed, their certainty began to crack. One by one, the student pilots found themselves facing the same impossible choice Viper had confronted in the Hindu Kush Mountains. Follow orders and watch simulated Americans die, or break protocol and act on conscience. Most chose to follow orders. It was the safe choice, the career-smart choice, the choice that wouldn't result in court-martial proceedings. But it was also the choice that left their simulated ground teams to face annihilation alone. Lieutenant Chen was different. As her simulated SEALs called desperately for support, as their ammunition ran low and casualties mounted, she made the same decision Viper had made 2 years earlier. "I'm going in," Chen announced over the training frequency. "Ground team needs immediate support." The scenario ended with Chen's simulated aircraft delivering devastating fire on enemy positions, saving the ground team but violating direct orders in the process. As the other students filed out of the briefing room, talking among themselves about Chen's reckless decision-making, Viper asked her to stay behind. "Why did you do it?" Viper asked once they were alone. Chen met her instructor's gaze without flinching. "Because it was the right thing to do, ma'am. Sometimes that has to be enough." Viper smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn in months. "It usually is, Lieutenant, but be prepared for the consequences. The right thing doesn't always lead to the easy path." That evening, Viper received an unexpected visitor. Colonel David "Striker" Kane, the F-22 pilot who had offered backup during Operation Steel Rain, stood in her office doorway in service dress uniform adorned with stars she didn't recognize. "Congratulations on the promotion, sir," she said, nodding the single star of a brigadier general. Kane waved away the formalities. "I'm not here about rank, Kestrel. I'm here about a job offer." He laid a classified folder on her desk, its red cover stamped with security markings she hadn't seen since her combat days. "We're forming a new unit, pilots who have proven they can make the hard decisions when it matters. People who understand that sometimes you have to break the rules to uphold the values those rules were meant to protect." Viper opened the folder and scanned the contents. It was a training program for Special Operations Air Support, designed to prepare pilots for the kind of complex, ethically ambiguous missions that didn't fit neatly into standard operating procedures. "You want me to train pilots to disobey orders?" she asked. Kane shook his head. "I want you to train pilots to think, to understand the difference between blind obedience and intelligent compliance, to know when following orders serves the mission and when it betrays it." It was an opportunity to return to meaningful work, to prepare the next generation for the moral complexities of modern warfare. But it was also a recognition that her actions in Afghanistan, far from being aberrant, represented exactly the kind of thinking the Air Force needed to cultivate. "When do I start?" she asked. Kane smiled. "How about tomorrow, Colonel?" The promotion came as a complete surprise. Apparently, some fights were worth winning, even if they took years to resolve. 3 months later, Colonel Kestrel Viper Thorne stood before her first class of advanced close air support students at Nellis Air Force Base. These weren't fresh academy graduates, but seasoned combat pilots, many with multiple deployments and hard-won experience in the complexities of modern warfare. Her teaching philosophy had evolved since her days at Randolph. Instead of presenting ethical dilemmas as abstract scenarios, she used real missions, some successful, some catastrophic, all instructive in their own way. Her students learned not just tactics and procedures, but the weight of command decisions and the price of moral courage. The program she developed became known throughout the Air Force as the Viper Course, though she never used that term herself. It was 8 weeks of intensive training that combined advanced flying techniques with ethical decision-making, crisis leadership, and what she called moral navigation, the ability to find the right path when all the maps pointed in different directions. One afternoon, while reviewing after-action reports from her students' training missions, Viper received a call that would change everything again. "Colonel Thorne," the voice belonged to General Patricia Hayes, the Air Force Chief of Staff. "I need to see you in Washington. How soon can you be here?" The Pentagon office where they met was decorated with the artifacts of military history, flags from famous battles, photographs of aviation pioneers, models of aircraft that had shaped the course of world events. General Hayes gestured for Viper to sit, then poured coffee from a service that looked like it had survived several wars. "I've been reading about your training program," Hayes began. "The feedback from your graduates has been extraordinary. More importantly, their performance in theater has been exceptional." Viper had heard the reports. Her students were making names for themselves in combat zones around the world, not through reckless heroics, but through intelligent application of force and moral courage under pressure. They were the pilots other units requested by name, the ones who could be trusted with the most complex and sensitive missions. "I have a proposal," Hayes continued. "We're establishing a new position, Director of Ethical Combat Training. The job would be to develop curriculum and standards for moral decision-making across all Air Force combat specialties. You'd have carte blanche to design the program as you see fit." It was the kind of offer that came once in a career, the chance to influence an entire generation of warriors, to shape the moral foundation of American air power. But it was also a desk job, far removed from the cockpits and flight lines where the real work happened. "General," Viper said carefully, "I appreciate the opportunity, but my place is with the pilots, training the next generation, not designing policy papers." Hayes smiled. "I hoped you'd say that, because what I'm really offering is the chance to do both. You'd develop the training standards, but you'd also lead the implementation. Every combat pilot in the Air Force would go through your program before deploying." The scope was staggering. Thousands of pilots, each carrying the moral framework she would help design into combat zones around the world. The influence was almost unimaginable, and so was the responsibility. "I'll need complete autonomy over curriculum design," Viper said, "and I want to handpick my instructor staff." "Done. And I want the program to be mandatory for all ranks, from second lieutenants to general officers." Hayes laughed. "That might be a harder sell, but I'll make it happen." 6 months later, the Viper Institute for Ethical Combat Operations opened at Nellis Air Force Base. The name wasn't Viper's choice. The Air Force brass insisted on honoring her contributions, but she'd learned to accept recognition gracefully, even when she'd rather focus on the work itself. The Institute's motto, inscribed in bronze above the main entrance, came from her own court-martial testimony. Sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. It was a principle that would guide American air power for generations to come. The morning sun painted the Nevada desert in shades of gold and crimson as Colonel Viper Thorne conducted her final flight evaluation before retirement. After 25 years of service, countless combat missions, and the establishment of an ethical training program that had become the gold standard for military aviation, she was finally ready to step away from active duty. Her student for this final flight was Major Lisa Falcon Rodriguez, a young A-10 pilot whose record showed both exceptional skill and the kind of moral courage that couldn't be taught in textbooks. Rodriguez had volunteered for the most dangerous missions, consistently put her aircraft between enemy forces and friendly ground troops, and never lost a soldier under her protection. Today's scenario is different from our usual training, Viper explained as they walked toward their aircraft. No predetermined objectives, no scripted enemy responses. We're going to fly a real mission, humanitarian supply drop to refugees in disputed territory. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. Ma'am, are you saying this isn't a simulation? Viper smiled. Sometimes the best training is the real thing, Major. The refugees are Syrian families caught between government forces and rebel groups. Both sides consider the area hostile. Neither can guarantee safe passage for relief supplies, and people are dying while diplomats debate access. It was the kind of mission that fell into the gray areas of international law, technically unauthorized, potentially career-ending if it went wrong, but more.